Hi everyone, Kate here for a very special video. I have some lovely guests from the George Eliot Fellowship. I have John Burton, the chairman, and Vivienne Wood, the vice chairman. So we are going to chat about the George Eliot Fellowship and all things George Eliot. So I was really pleased when they accepted to discuss George Eliot with me, and I have a fair number of questions. So I guess, why don't we open with Vivienne and John, you could tell about how you became involved with the fellowship.
Right. Do you want to start, Viv? Ladies first?
No, after you, John.
All right. I did a part of my degree was an English degree, and then I became a teacher in Coventry, which is only 6 or 7 miles down the road, and George Eliot lived there for a time. But then I moved to teach in Nuneaton, and I was an English teacher as well. So there was a sort of inevitability, really, about a secondary school English teacher and getting better acquainted with George Eliot. I think when I was a student, I'd read The Mill on the Floss, and I think Silas Marner, but not much more than that. And then becoming a teacher, I did become much more interested and fascinated really by the woman who grew up in the area, spent the first 21 years of her life in the area. And so I joined the George Eliot Fellowship. I have to confess, I didn't do a lot of teaching of George Eliot, but there we are. I'm trying to make up for that now. I joined the committee, the council of the George Eliot Fellowship, and took on various responsibilities, and then became chairman in 2006.
Okay, so that's been a long stretch then that you've been the chairman.
Yes, it sometimes seems a lot longer than that.
But I take it as a sign that it's been a rewarding experience if you're still doing it.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, the fellowship is lovely, and there are lots of lovely people in it. But what is really driving you is George Eliot, the writer. You know, the wonderful words she uses and the wisdom she displays, and that makes all the sometimes tedious work of running the fellowship worthwhile.
That's wonderful. If you have a passion for a project, the work is good and rewarding work.
Absolutely. Yes, it is.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And then Vivienne, how did you come to be involved?
Yes, well, it sounds quite similar to John's experience, actually. My family moved to the Nuneaton area, and I was teaching at a sixth form college in Nuneaton. It actually is, George Eliot does name it in Scenes of Clerical Life. She talks about the grammar school run on reformed lines. So we're talking about King Edward Sixth Form College, one of those in England, the educator king of the 16th century. He set up all these schools. 1552, the buildings, well, they're not original anymore, but yeah, the foundation goes back to 1552. So I was teaching in a sixth form college, which in England is the top end of the secondary age group, 16 to 18, and I did teach some George Eliot. I did teach, for example, Mill on the Floss for their A level, for their advanced levels, and prepared many of them to go off to university. Some of them studied English at university. That was my background. I studied English, like John, at university, was a teacher all my life. And I suppose, just like John, I became fascinated. I had also read some of George Eliot at university. I remember reading Middlemarch, very good thing to read when you're pregnant and you're sitting around. I remember reading that. Yeah, but it was really moving to Nuneaton, that it just grabs you. The area grabs you. The heritage, the sense of literary heritage grabs you, because you see that actually, although she became, Eliot's life is divided into two halves, as I'm sure, people know, very clearly almost. Half of it is in the Midlands, and then half of it is so cosmopolitan down in London, and then all the travels she and her partner did across Europe and so on. So but you know, those, we all know the importance of the formative years, and we know that although she did move out into other novels like goodness me, Italy, 15th century Italy, and she did have little goes at things, but always she kept coming back to what she knew, the Midlands and the landscape and the stories that she'd grown up with. She just must have had the most amazing memory for hearing stories that her father, who was the agent at the local stately home, Arbury Hall, he that was his world, Arbury Hall. It was her world to some extent too. And in her very first fiction, Mr. Gilfil's love story, it's all based on that stately home, Arbury Hall. So she's all the time clocking, growing up in the area. She's clocking the Midlands accents as well, all that dialect that comes out. And she's writing about it many years later, because she didn't write when she was in the Midlands. Well, she was a journalist actually, but not, she didn't start her fiction until she'd left the Midlands, but she's clocked it, she's stored it all away. And so really, I suppose for me to be teaching in Warwickshire, it's the north of the county. It's a very special county. We always say this to our students, because they've got Shakespeare in the south, yes, and they have George Eliot in the north, you know, which is extraordinary. So yeah, I tried to foster a sense of wonder, I suppose, in my students, that they too had been born in this area. And as we developed it, and John and I perhaps will talk about this later, but we actually worked with our students to do some dramatizations of the novels. And I always used to find that the students from the Nuneaton area, they could remember whole swathes of George Eliot. Well, if you've read any George Eliot, you know she's not always very succinct, is she? But they could remember loads. And I used to think it's because they have grown up with the kind of rhythms of the Nuneaton and Bedworth accents, and they've heard their great aunts or their grandmas use some of the dialect, you know. So it was very natural to the students. We never had any trouble, did we, John, with students forgetting words or anything?
No, we didn't. It was a fascinating experience, really. And it sort of broke new ground for the fellowship, I think. It had a very honourable history of doing things, and it grew. The previous chairman and secretary inherited, or took over really, the George Eliot Fellowship in about 1968, 1969, just before the 150th anniversary of her birth, and they set up a programme of events. But at that point, there were about 26 members in the fellowship, you know, and some of them I think were sleeping. And Kathleen and Bill, who moved in really, and she became the secretary, and they went through the thing like a dose of salts. And by the 80s, they'd got about 600 members. It was quite extraordinary. But as they were getting older and perhaps less innovative, it was a happy coincidence, really, I think, that from 2006, 2008 onwards, Viv was involved as well with the fellowship, and her work and experience of teaching George Eliot at the college was fantastic. It was a happy coincidence that a whole series of 150th anniversaries of the novels was happening, you know, as we were sort of getting into gear to take over the fellowship's running. So 2007, Scenes of Clerical Life, and 2008, 2009, Adam Bede, 2010, Mill on the Floss, 2011, Silas Wilde. It was an absolute godsend. And Viv and her students and another man, Simon Winterman, who has been a key to our success with these things. Viv dramatized the novels and the students performed them, and they were marvelous. You know, professional actors might balk at the enormity of what they were doing. They just did it. And so we took these plays for performances locally. And it was lovely because it introduced new people to George Eliot, but it also introduced students, bright youngsters, you know, who are now all over the place. They've done their degrees and they've moved on. But we like to think, I think, Viv and I, that they will never forget that experience of being part of their town and taking part in something that this wonderful writer who lived in the same town as they do or did, that they were involved with it. So it was really, I think it was really satisfying for us, wasn't it, Viv, that feeling that we were doing important things with youngsters. With
And
also, of course.
yeah, that's wonderful. And then they'll be, you know, willing to carry on the legacy and maybe become involved with the fellowship. And I think that's really just special that you did several theatrical adaptations, because I think you can really see and experience tangibly from that the struggles and the joys that these characters are having are very transcendent, and something that we can relate to in any time period in certain ways and forms.
Yeah.
So do you each have maybe one event that really to you has been a big highlight?
Well, I mean, Viv could talk more about this, because after that sequence of scenes, Mill on the Floss, Silas Marner, she then did Felix Holt, which is a complex novel, and to compress it into an hour for the Edinburgh Festival was an achievement, and it was Viv who did it. So some of those students, and Simon, who had by then stopped teaching at the college but still works very closely with us and runs a very good amateur theatrical company in Nuneaton, they took it up to Edinburgh. And then Viv also last year, and she can tell you more about this really, she adapted Mr. Gilfil's love story, the middle one of the Scenes of Clerical Life, which was, as Viv said earlier, is set at Arbury. And Viv wrote the adaptation of it, and we performed it in the grounds of Arbury Hall as part of our bicentenary. So
Wow.
Last year was marvellous, really. And I mean, we can both talk about our highlights from that. It was a fabulous year. I think we like to think that we did George Eliot proud. It might really mostly have been in the Nuneaton area, and we're not a big enough fellowship to have branches elsewhere who might also have done things, but within the limits we did, I think, marvelous things, and that would have been one of my favorite events, certainly in recent years, was Mr. Gilfil's love story in the grounds of Arbury Hall. I have to say my granddaughter played one of the lead parts, so that was a help.
Oh, that's wonderful, and so great that it all happened in 2019 as opposed to it being scheduled for 2020.
I mean, each day we thank Mr. and Mrs. Evans for not producing their daughter a year later.
Yes, yes. And
you know.
Yeah, so Vivienne, is some of the events that happened in 2019, those were a big highlight for you?
Yes, it was an amazing year. We had an international literary academic conference based at the University of Leicester, and academics came from all over the world and presented papers as they do. And actually, one of the highlights for me was there were two coaches, I think. Were there two coaches, John, or one? Two coaches loads full of academics who then at the 70 end, yeah, 70 people. Yeah. And they actually came to, we sort of did a mini tour, because actually that's something, John, well, we haven't hardly begun to tell you about the events that we offer. I mean, every year we have a full programme, Kate. So last year was tremendous, but actually we're a pretty lively literary society anyway, with lectures and theatricals and various things. But John and I, twice a year, we run a literary tour, and it takes about 7 or 8 hours. So it's not for the faint-hearted, really, but we hire a coach and we take people on all the sites. It is the most wonderful experience. In fact, I never really answered your question about how did I get involved in the fellowship. I mean, it was
that's okay. You could tell me now.
It was actually, just sort of came back to me. It was actually my moving to Nuneaton and thinking, oh, what is this place? You know, where do I start? I've got a new job here, but I don't know it at all. And I saw this George Eliot tour advertised. And in those days, when the councils had money, it was actually run by the council. And this literary tour sounded so interesting, and it was visiting all the places, including, only on this literary tour can you see the actual birthplace of Mary Ann Evans. You cannot see it any other time. It's almost our unique selling point, actually.
It is.
Wow.
Yeah. So I quickly signed up for that, and that's how I joined the fellowship, because the tour was just mind-blowing. It was so interesting. So there we are, a little industrial market, Midlands town, and it's got all these treasures in it. So yes, we saw the actual South Farm Cottage where George Eliot was born. She only lived there for 5 months, but we all sort of could look up at the window where she was born. And it was a cottage that came with the job. You know, it's part of Arbury Estate. Obviously, part of the tour is a 2-hour, 1 hour, I suppose, tour of Arbury Hall itself. And then, you know, you can have tea and wander in the beautiful grounds. But also, it's not just that. We can see Griff. Griff is where she and her family moved. She was 5 months old, and they moved to just on the outskirts of Nuneaton. A very exciting place in many ways. She lived there for 21 years. And it's from that experience of living there that so many of her memories come, particularly from in Mill on the Floss. You remember Mill on the Floss is the most, well, it's semi-autobiographical, really. It's about a brother and a sister growing up. And it's really, she's recapturing her childhood growing up with Isaac Evans, her brother. And even things like there's Gypsy Lane just opposite Griff. I mean, some of your viewers might remember that Maggie is she's a child that I think so many of us relate to growing up. You know, she knew the sorrows of childhood, but also the great joys. She adored her older brother and would just trot around after him wherever they went, fishing, and he would play with her, and it was her really first deep love. And of course, we know what happens as the terrible tragedy that happened in her own life when her own brother rejected her and didn't speak to her for about 33 years because she was living with a married man. And I'm sure we'll perhaps get on to talk about her actual story. But, you know, this is all captured, her lovely childhood memories growing up, but also the frustrations because her hair didn't sit properly. It wasn't pretty and fair or in ringlets like her cousin Lucy. Lucy's supposed to be based on her sister, actually, Chrissy. So there's poor old Mary Ann growing up, feeling a sense that she was plain and that she had this sort of wild hair, and she was a disappointment to her, certainly to her mother, never to her father. And you get that in the novel. You get the tremendous love that Mr. Tulliver has for his little wench, he calls her. And, you know, he always took her part in everything. But she's recreated a lot of those stories, and they all happen around Griff. And when Tom goes off to school, it's heartbreak for Maggie because she's lost her big brother and her playmate and so on. But then things change, and we know that from the novel that the shades of the prison house descend, as we know, almost Wordsworthian, really.
I think that's a good segue then. Can you speak about the progress that's being made on turning Griff House into a literary home that people can visit?
Yes, but this is very exciting. John and I were only at a meeting with the architect this morning, so we come back really fired up. How many years ago was it, John?
8 years. It's not also, Kate, it's not actually Griff House itself that will become the visitor centre. Griff House, the standard, if you look at any biography of George Eliot, one of the standard views is the front of Griff House. And we take our visitors to see that. That's part of the Beefeater restaurant chain owned by Whitbread's. It's a big company in the UK. And at the back of it is a Premier Inn. But what we've got, or hopefully, is fingers and toes and everything crossed at the moment, because this has been going on for 8 years. But round the back, well, Griff House is a lovely building, of course, but it was a farmhouse. And so when Robert Evans, as Viv described, them living at South Farm, the move to Griff was a bit of a promotion, really, for him. It was a bigger place, it was a bigger farm, and he was doing well as the agent. So at the back of Griff House, there was a whole, the normal farm, all the farm buildings, and many of those are still there, but they don't belong to the hotel chain. But there is one little bit just by the back door, a tiny little building which is tumbling down. And 8 years ago, Whitbreads, who own Griff, are trying to get planning permission to pull it down. Because they said it was dangerous, and it probably was. 8 years later, it's still there. But we objected, and we were allowed to have our 3 minutes say at the planning committee meeting, and the council, to their great credit, actually, turned down the recommendation of their own conservation officer that it should be allowed, and in effect gave us time to try to do something with the building to save it in some way. But even then, it was in a pretty parlous state of repair, to be quite honest. And I can remember after that meeting of the council planning committee thinking, oh goodness, what have we taken on? Because I've been involved in fundraising for derelict buildings in other parts of the borough, and I knew that it would not be easy. But then a few months after that, Whitbreads, as the owners, actually came up with a proposal that they would, as far as they could, match fund or contribute up to 50% of the building costs or restoration costs, up to a maximum of £80,000. It's moved on from there, and we've tried in all sorts of ways to raise the money. And now we have got enough. We were
Yay.
enormously helped by a local man. It's a lovely story, really, of a local man, an ordinary chap from Bedworth, which is about 2 miles up the road from Griff. Griff is midway between Nuneaton and Bedworth, really. And this man is a multimillionaire, but he grew up in one of the side streets in Bedworth, and has never forgotten it. He won't give money to Nuneaton, but he will give money to Bedworth. And he lives in Jersey, and when he's not in Jersey, he's in Florida. So he, money is not a problem for him. And we'd asked him about 3 years ago if he would help us, and he said, no, I'm not interested in George Eliot, but good luck. And then another application for funding fell through from the Heritage Lottery Fund in the UK. And we were a bit despairing, really. And so we thought, well, let's ask John Miller, this is the man's name, let's ask him again. And last October, the phone rang 9 o'clock one Monday morning, and he said, this is John Miller. It looks as if you need 70,000 to complete it. I'd like to give you 70,000. It's a very nice start to the week.
Yes.
So basically, we've got enough money. I mean, it's quite a small thing, as Viv said. It's not a huge place, but it's a start. And the biggest advantage for us is that it's there. This is where George Eliot lived. She would have known this farmyard. She would have come out of that back door. And so there's so much that we can do to place George Eliot in her surroundings, in her rural surroundings, because that often, actually it's happening a bit more now, but that hasn't been something that the critics have been so keen on. They're now very keen on geographical links and place, that sort of feeling of place in novels and their lives. So we're really set to exploit that. We're really, as Viv said, it's been exciting. We've had so many disappointments, you wouldn't believe it, but we're hanging in there, and 8 years down the line, I think it's going to happen. Don't you, Viv, after this morning? I think we feel,
absolutely. Maybe this.
All fingers crossed.
Well, yeah, I think literary tourism is more of a thing. And I've heard from multiple people when they visit a beloved author's home, how they feel like a deeper kinship and connection to the author. And kind of just seeing how they are just a person like we are. And these are
Yeah.
kind of where they did their mundane tasks,
Yes,
is really,
absolutely.
really lovely. So even if it's, not the whole thing, it's still really marvelous that this is
Yeah.
happening.
Well, Viv was talking earlier about going to South Farm, that people can only see South Farm if they come on one of our tours. But as we said, we took these 70 academics from all over the world, and they were absolutely thrilled to bits. These were people from Japan and China and Europe and the States. And we were able to take them. And the agent, it's strange that Robert Evans was the agent to the estate who lived at South Farm. The present day, 200 years later, the agent to the Arbour estate still lives in that house.
Wow.
And he's marvelous because he and his partner allow us to bring a coachload of people to trample over the grass and to look up at, that's the bedroom that she was born in, And there were these very serious academics who was almost gambling about like young lambs, coming to this wonderful place where the author they've worked hard on, they've done their degrees and their postgraduate work on. This is where she was born. That was a really exciting thing, wasn't it, Viv? It began to rain shortly after, but that didn't matter.
Yes.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the first George Eliot piece of work that you read?
I think it was Mill on the Floss.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just captivated. There's something about her that as soon as you start reading George Eliot, you feel that you're in the company of somebody extraordinarily wise and very clever. It's not I'm clever and I'm going to show you I'm clever. It's just there. It's that sort of, it's part of who she is. So I think I was fascinated by that. And I think we often do return. Viv mentioned this earlier, that we return to the books that are based really locally, which tend to be the earlier novels, where that sense of place is even more pronounced. So not a lot of people, even people who have read quite a lot of George Eliot, haven't necessarily read Scenes of Clerical Life. But I love them. I absolutely love those three stories, because when we're taking a group either on the tour or we do talks or walks, we can say to our audience, we can take them to Chilverscoaton Parish Church, which is George Eliot's Shepperton, and we can point up at the clock on the tower and read in the first paragraph of the short story her description of the intelligent eye, the clock. And so that is marvelous. And so we tend to use those three short stories quite a lot because it generates interest in our local people. We get the interest of local people by saying, yeah, but look, that just over there is where Lawyer Dempster lived, and then where he beat up his wife, and they can relate to that sense of place and being able to position and envisage what it was like. So that's enormously helpful for us to be able to do those sorts of things.
Yeah, actually, Scenes of Clerical Life I haven't read yet, but I'm planning for Victober to read it, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
You'll love it.
I'm excited. And then Vivienne, what was your first George Eliot work?
Yes, my first was Silas Marner, and it's still a favourite of mine. And the interesting thing about Silas Marner was that Eliot was really famous by this point. She was so popular. She had success after success after success. Adam Bede outsold A Tale of Two Cities, for example. I mean, Dickens actually, to go back to Scenes of Clerical Life, Dickens was one of her greatest fans. I mean, at the early point of publication of Scenes of Clerical Life, she hadn't revealed who she was. I mean, people assumed it was written by a male cleric, but it was Charles Dickens who suspected that possibly the sad fortunes of Amos Barton really could have been written by a woman, or he was damned if any man he knew could have written it. But I mean, that was the nearest anyone got to sort of blowing her cover. But by the time she got to Adam Bede, she revealed who she was, and then it was Mill on the Floss. And honestly, you're talking about phenomenal success. I mean, I think Adam Bede that's only her second novel. That was translated into Hungarian, Russian, French, German. You know, as I say, outsold Tale of Two Cities. Mill on the Floss. She just couldn't turn off the tap of her earnings. She was so wealthy by this point. So there she is, and I mentioned this earlier, that she was going to turn her attention to a very interesting medieval period in Italian history with Savonarola and Romola. Not always her people's favourite novel. I think it's marvellous, actually, but yeah, it was. She was pushing herself, as writers do, and they need to. They need to spread their wings. But she was struggling with Romola, and she said that she just had this memory of a bent over little weaver walking through the streets of Stockingford, which is an area of Nuneaton, and he was sort of bent with his bag on his back, and he was selling the cloth to people. And that's how Silas Marner started. She just sort of got up and she sort of dashed this story off, which is a sort of fairy tale. The pub is called The Rainbow. And of course, there's so much imagery of the gold in Silas Marner. And it is almost, and I do believe, you know, at this time that in a sense she identified strongly with poor old Silas Marner. He had been betrayed where he used to live, much further north. And he'd started a new life down in Raveloe, which again, local people like to think it's Bolkington, near, again, very close to Nuneaton, an area of Nuneaton. And he just started a new life, but he always lived as a miser on the edge. He would not trust humans again. And he just sold his cloth, and he sold his cloth, and he weaved. Well, he was a great weaver, very short-sighted, and the imagery of the insects is astonishing. You know, the bulbous eyes almost as he bent over the cloth and produced all this cloth, went out to sell it, and then of course at night came his revelry. And of course the revelry is counting his money, and it's all the gold that he had stored. And then of course one day the gold is stolen, and this is a terrible, it's almost a breakdown the way she describes it, this howling of misery, of the love of his life. His gold is stolen. And then of course gold in another form is given to him. A child with these golden curls is sort of abandoned outside his doorstep, and he takes her in, and I think Eliot really knew what it felt like to be an outcast, to feel alone, a bit like Silas Marner. And also because she had by this time was living with George Henry Lewis, who we really believe was the man who encouraged her. I do not believe we would have had George Eliot. Personally, this is only my opinion, but I don't think we'd have had her without this love and encouragement of George Henry Lewis. And he sort of nurtured her, and he shielded her from reviews if they were bad. They were mostly good, but you know, she was quite sensitive. They were a terrific partnership, actually. But you see, with George Henry Lewis, his marriage had previously irretrievably broken down, and we would think nothing of it today, actually, that they lived together. But this was the great scandal for poor old George Eliot, really. And the reason her brother back in Nuneaton wouldn't speak to her for so long, 33 years, I think.
Wow.
But anyway, the thing is that he had 3 children from his former marriage, and in a way George Eliot was beginning to discover the joy of being a stepmother and the joy of family life. So she's woven, if you'll excuse the pun, she's woven all that into this novel of Silas Marner, the sort of sense of being an outcast, because she was rejected by Victorian England for living with a married man. They wanted to get married. It's just the stuffy old English laws of the 19th century wouldn't allow her. I mean, there is a particular reason why George Henry Lewis couldn't get a divorce, and that's because his wife had children with his best friend and also business partner at one point, Thornton Hunt, and he had condoned them. He was a bit like that, you know, he was sort of, oh, well, free love and everything. And he had condoned them, and he had put his name to these children on the birth certificate, and because of that he was seen as condoning his wife's adultery. So because of that he was never able to get a divorce. So there's Mary Ann Evans. Marian, she's calling herself now. She dropped the Mary Ann. Early 20s. She was always changing her name, actually. It's quite interesting. But Marian she felt a more grown-up name than Mary Ann. So she became Marian Evans, and then she always called herself Marian Lewis or Marian Evans Lewis to the end of her days. I mean, not quite the end of her days, because in the last 8 or 9 months, I think, of her life, she did actually marry. She married a John Cross. So for the last year of her life, or 8 months of her life, she was she called herself, Marian Cross, another name. Yeah, intriguing woman.
She really is. So now I want to ask you your favorite George Eliot book, and I know it's like choosing a favorite child, but if you do, or maybe what is your favorite lately out of her books?
I love Felix Holt.
Felix Holt.
I really do. I know Middlemarch is up there, and it's often cited the greatest novel in the English language, and I do love that too. But Felix Holt, I've never seen a description like the description of Mrs. Transome. The novel opens with this woman quite troubled, waiting for her son to come home, and you really get into the psychology of Mrs. Transome. And I think that's one of the things that I love about George Eliot, that she's sort of, as D.H. Lawrence said, she opened it all up. She opened up all this psychology. You know, you go into a woman's mind with a secret psychology, or the deep anguish of, say, having a secret, and living with your past, and having regrets about the past. I just think it's extraordinarily modern. And I would also say that Janet's Repentance is one of my favourites too. I remember reading that so many years ago now, probably 30 years ago, and we did actually dramatise it with the students. And all the time I was thinking, I cannot believe this. You know, this is wife beating. The woman's an alcoholic, by the way. It's all so modern. And actually, you know, you even sort of get like a 12-step program in Janet's Repentance, because there's the minister, Mr. Tryon, who comes alongside Janet and sort of almost encourages her to sort of do the steps to kind of overcome her weakness for alcohol, and then of course she finds such satisfaction and peace in giving to others, thinking, you know, serving others, and there's great joy that comes in not just thinking of yourself.
Actually, Felix Holt then it's the only other thing besides Scenes of Clerical Life that I haven't read, so I'm planning on taking it on. But I like the notion of having one George Eliot full-length novel left unread, but then I also know how rewarding she is to reread, so it's
interesting really, because I mean, Felix Holt, Viv described it beautifully, and of course she knows it very well because she wrote the adaptation for the Edinburgh Festival. But it's one of the novels that is less well read. You know, there are lots of people who are enthusiasts for George Eliot, but they haven't actually read Felix Holt, and often they haven't read Romola either. I love. It's very difficult to say. I tend to love the one I'm reading at the time, you know, but I do love those early Scenes of Clerical Life, because in a way they were breaking it was new ground, you know. And here was this woman, mid-30s, writing Amos Barton, which is the first one. And it's short, 60, 70 pages. But it's an absolutely perfect little short story. And she's dealing with, but she tells you what she's going to do. She's aware of the fact that she's breaking new ground, really. So we've got the Reverend Amos Barton, who is a pretty nondescript sort of fellow, you know. He's supposed to be an evangelical preacher, curate in the Church of England. But he's pretty hopeless at it, you know. And there's a wonderful scene where he has to go and deliver a sermon to the inmates of the workhouse, which it was just up the road. I mean, Chilverscote Workhouse was only a few hundred yards from the vicarage that he lived in. And it must have been awful. Imagine yourself, fairly erudite and interested in theology, having to preach to people who were barely literate and who carried all the social problems that poor people often have. And it's such a classic example of nobody communicating to anybody, but that's what he has to do. And George Eliot, it's wonderful. Viv and I did a reading of it, or adaptation of it, in Chilverscote Church. That's the lovely thing that we can do during the bicentennial last year. So we just shortened it, took out the best bits, and we got a choir who also sang in between our readings.
Oh.
At about chapter 4 or chapter 5, she sort of breaks off from the story and says, "Oh, well, by the way, I'm not going to follow the normal sort of storytelling route. I'm going to, because I don't like that. It's all artificial, and I'm going to tell you about ordinary people." And of course she does throughout. She's talking about ordinary people and the extraordinary, which is in ordinary people. And you see it in all the novels, really, but it's there it's there in the first short story she writes. And in a way, the first paragraph of Amos Barton encapsulates pretty well the theme of what she's going to be writing about for the next 25 years, of looking back at the past, and most of them do, a generation, sometimes 2 generations. Romola, as Viv said, goes back to the 15th century Florence, but that's the exception. Most of them are in the fairly recent past, and she's just so analytical about what's happening and how it's affecting people. But they're not novels of social unrest, and there isn't a political agenda, none of that sort of thing, which can sully novels for later readers, I think. All human nature, they're so psychologically perceptive and knowledgeable and wise, and you see that in this very first short story, right on at the start of her career as a writer. So I do find that really interesting, and to be able to take people to the church and to show them and to look over the road that's the school that was mentioned, and it's still there, it's now a heritage centre. All those sorts of things enrich what we do in the Nuneaton area, which is a huge privilege.
That's wonderful. So then if somebody has not read anything from George Eliot, what do you think is a good first piece to pick?
I think Silas Marner is often the one we recommend, because for one thing, it is quite short, and it is a sort of form almost of a fairy tale. So that's, and funnily enough, I've only last few months, I have actually adapted Silas Marner into a children's book. So it's one of those, we hope to sell it it's for sale now, but I'm just saying that it just adapted, it wrote itself. It's not much of me in it. It's all George Eliot's wonderful language. And so I think to start with Silas Marner is good. I think the length of George Eliot does put so many people off. And I think this is what we struggle with as a literary fellowship. We don't have the pulling power or something. We don't have the je ne sais quoi of, say, the Jane Austen Society or the Brontes, for example, are where to start. But as John says, Scenes of Clerical Life, in a way, these are 3 novellas, all for the price of one. And when it was the 150th year of the publication of,
That's okay.
When it was the 150th year of the publication of Scenes of Clerical Life, we purchased how many, John? And we gave them freely. Sorry.
Well, we worked with the publisher, and we bought 7,000. We commissioned our own edition of Scenes, really, and we got one of our academic vice presidents to do an introduction to it, Graham Handley, and we got a local artist to do a cover, a watercolor picture of the church at Chilverscoaton, and then we gave them all away. So we gave away 7,000 copies.
Wow.
Mostly, the idea was to give them to local reading groups or interest groups in Warwickshire, so within the county. But obviously, they went to other places, that was a lovely thing to do, actually. And they still turn up on eBay occasionally. And we would love to reprint them, but of course the difficulty is you only get economies of cost if you buy whose number, and you have to have somewhere to store the damn things. But what we would quite like to do when we get the visitor centre is to publish them as the 3 separate stories.
Wow.
Amos Barton, Mr. Gilfil's love story, Janet's repentance, and then you would then end up with 3 much thinner books, and people, as Viv said, people are a bit put off by the length of some of her novels. Yes. And so this would, and it would be an inexpensive way of people saying, well, yeah, I'll try that. I'll try it. It's only 70. And Mr. Gilfil is only about 70, 80 pages. Janet's Repentance is longer. But I think that might be for us a way of marketing George Eliot in a more palatable way. If it's only 2 or 3 quid, people will buy one of them and have a go, I think. And as Viv said also with Silas Marner, when I'm often asked, particularly by councillors, when they become mayor, and they know they're going to be invited to George Eliot things, and they then confess, well, I'm sorry, I haven't actually read any George Eliot. What ought I to start on? Which is the easiest one? And I usually would say, well, Silas Marner, because it's got a happy ending as well, which not all George Eliot's novels do. But it does. But there's so much wisdom and sensitivity and joy, as Viv said. It's like a fairy story, and Viv's adaptation of it is brilliant. It's really lovely.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
I think it's good you're thinking about selling the 3 bind-ups as individual ones. I think you have to have for different classic authors a gateway into their work. And, I mentioned this before, I love Wuthering Heights and I love Jane Eyre, but I find that the staying power of George Eliot's novels really is just such a reward. And I think if you go into her books thinking this will ask more of me than the average book with my attention, with the pacing, but it's going to give me so much. And I read Romola at the beginning of the year, and that was, the most challenging for me out of her books. But now today I can I still even tear up just thinking about some of the scenes in it. I can just picture it so vividly.